very progressive section in our contract, and I would encourage anyone to add that into your own union contract. But what in the main I wanted to talk about today, and I wanted to thank Andy for his remarks earlier. I think he really set the stage. And what I want to say is that we've entered a new period, right? A period marked by revolution and counter-revolution globally and here in the US. This is not a straight line process. It's always going to be a back and forth, a tug of war between the forces of revolution and counter-revolution. And whether you're looking at the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia or Wisconsin, the Occupy Wall Street movement which spread across the country, I believe these are harbingers of the battles to come. And that new layers of workers and youth are going to move into these struggles. They're going to be radicalized by what they see there. They're going to begin to draw socialist conclusions. And among them will be thousands and thousands of women. These women are going to be propelled into those movements by the economic imperatives that we've discussed, but also genuinely by the desire for a better life, you know, for this freedom from rape culture. And in the same way that Occupy gave us such a strong push forward by naming the enemy, by the 1%, I believe that this movement of young women have done us such a service in naming rape culture. That is the enemy, and that now we can deal with that culture. But just back, women are going to move into battle for a better life, for the freedom from rape culture, the ability to develop themselves to their full potential. And as we used to say, for bread and roses. It's not just about the money, it's about a better life. And of course, the background to all these fights is the world economic crisis, the fuel for that fire. And as all the other speakers have mentioned, capitalism's solution to that crisis is austerity. And I think we all know what that word means. At the beginning of the crisis, 2008, 2009, even into 2010, you remember there was this debate within the capitalist class, stimulus, austerity, which is the way forward. That debate has ended, and the answer is austerity, decisively 100% austerity. Austerity is bad for the working class. We know that to be true, but it is particularly bad for women. Women are disproportionately affected by austerity, and these effects are amplified for women of color, for unmarried women, for very young women, and for elderly women. And austerity disproportionately affects women as workers, as recipients of social services that we've heard, and as the caregivers, as Anne talked about, that shifting of the burden of provision of care from the public sector to domestic private homes. And particularly as workers. At the beginning of this recession, what the bourgeois economists define as recession, we may have a different definition, but what the bourgeois economists define as recession, the housing market was absolutely crushed, right? 2 million construction workers lost their jobs, more than 2 million manufacturing workers lost their jobs. And these are jobs primarily dominated by men, so that some commentators even called it a man-cession instead of a recession. And as those decreases in revenues filtered through the budgets of cities, states, and the federal government on the one hand, and the increases in expenses that those governments had for services, whether it's unemployment insurance or other services that those government bodies provide, they created these huge budget gaps, which the legislators of all stripe, solved by massive cuts to services. And the slaughter began, and women began to lose their jobs in the so-called recovery, what the bourgeois economists define as recovery. which has been very bad for us. Men lost their jobs in the recession. We are losing our jobs now in this so-called recovery. And the reason why we say this, Anne alluded to it, but women are 50% more likely to be employed by the public sector than are men. And if you look at those professions that are dominated by women, it will tell the tale. 97% of preschool and kindergarten teachers are women. 82% of middle school and elementary school teachers are women. 90% of nurses still are women. About 80% of nurses' aides, those women that used to provide those services in the home, home health aides, psychiatric aides, nurses' aides. Of course, the nurses and the aides are divided between the public and the private sector. Not all of them are going to be in the public sector, but many, many, many of them. Even we at Temple are considered technically to be in the public sector because Temple receives so much public money. We are in the public sector. There's also been myriad cuts at the state and local levels. Many, many, many cuts. For a period, you know, it was death by 1,000 cuts. I would say we in Philadelphia are austerity experts. I don't think there's ever been a budget in Philadelphia that hasn't included cuts in my memory. I don't know, you might remember longer. And it's never the bondholders that take a haircut, right? It's never that the banks don't get paid, right? And until sequestration, right, it's never been the Pentagon or the Defense Department. And though the dust hasn't settled on these cuts yet, and the leaders in those departments will likely be given more latitude to decide where the cuts actually come down than the leaders of other departments. But I would be willing to bet my bottom dollar that it's not going to be weapons systems that are cut. Right? It's going to be the VA that's cut, it's going to be the other services to veterans that are cut, and even though we want to see defense cuts, we don't want to see those programs cut, right? Because those cuts are going to come with layoffs for nurses in the VAs, for social workers that provide those services for returning veterans to find jobs and to assimilate back into civilian life. And there's been, you know, the lid has just started to be lifted on this huge problem of sexual violence in the military. And we have not heard the end of that at all. And if there will be any services for these women to deal with those traumas, these are the types of programs that are going to be cut if and when the defense experiences cuts. So, all these struggles and more are going to, sorry, I skipped the whole page. I'm sorry. Just to go back just a little bit, I'm sorry, to talk about all these struggles and more, right? It's difficult to find numbers about the exact numbers of layoffs, and not to forget furloughs too, days off without pay. It's, the statistics are a little bit difficult to call because these are local budgets and local governments. Someone with more time than I have would need to add all these numbers up. But certainly the number of teachers that have been laid off is in the hundreds of thousands. And this is a process that's just begun. We know, the brothers and sisters from Philadelphia know that we are still engaged in a struggle to save public education here. We don't know the numbers of teachers that will be laid off, but certainly there will be teachers laid off in the absence of the kind of fight that Anne was talking about. In Chicago, Mayor Emanuel has announced over 100 schools to close. Bloomberg in New York has already closed 100 schools and wants to close more. At the state level, too, in Philadelphia, we just got word Thursday night that House Bill 970 to privatize the wine and spirit shop passed through the House. It still needs to obviously pass the Senate and be signed on by the governor. But this is 5,000 family-sustaining jobs that will be lost. And with the privatization of wine and spirit shop, it's not only the jobs, it's also a question of public health, particularly underage drinking and the trauma, literally trauma that leads to, that is kids in the ER. but also the quality of life questions for our neighborhoods. Now, the public sector is not just under attack from budget cuts, but also it's been the focus of a vicious, concerted, well-orchestrated campaign by the right. And that campaign has a few goals, you know, to eliminate the notion that any of us still has, that we have a right to a public education, affordable housing, decent health care, on and on down the list. Also, they hate having that sector of the economy outside of their ability to profit from it. They don't have their fingers firmly in that, and they want it there. It's also to further eviscerate organized labor. You know, in the private sector, what unions make up, I think 6.6% of workers for this year, something like that. But in the public sector, there's still almost 36% of public sector workers are organized. This is funded by the Koch brothers and other tremendously wealthy individuals, and implemented by, you know, the famous Republican governors, Scott Walker, what's his name in Michigan, Rick Snyder, but also Democrats, right? In Massachusetts, Deval Patrick signed on to the legislation to eliminate the ability of public sector workers to bargain over their health care benefits. So it's not just the Republicans. And this campaign obviously has had its successes. Union membership dropped by 400,000 in 2012. Of those, 230,000 were public sector workers, and of those, 20% came from Wisconsin. 48,000 public sector workers are no longer unionized in Wisconsin. So these campaigns have taken their toll, will continue to take their toll without a fight back that includes the public sector workers allied together with the constituents that they serve, right? And we saw the little beginnings, the inklings of what power that could have with the Chicago teachers' strike that's already been talked about. So these public sector jobs, these are the good jobs that women are concentrated in, right? The women are overwhelmingly concentrated in the lowest paid jobs, clerical jobs, retail sales, housekeeping. And there's been a little glimmer of hope, you know, in the fall of 2012 with retail workers, right? Walmart workers across the country going out on strike, maybe in a symbolic way, but against the largest private employer in the US, one that was seen as beyond the reach of organized labor for decades, right? And also fast food workers in New York City. And though these organizing drives are outside the process defined by the National Labor Relations Board, they're clearly supported, funded, and organized by the unions. Particularly the UFCW, SEIU, and UE. Also taking in on the staff level, Occupy activists. We know quite a few who went to New York and were working on that campaign. Now the other speakers also talked about women as recipients of public services. Women live longer than men. They tend to get Social Security for longer, Medicare for longer. And because they were concentrated in these lower paid jobs that don't have pensions, that don't have retiree health care benefits, they're more likely to rely on Social Security as their sole income source. Women are also poorer than men, and all of these figures are more amplified for women of color, for elderly women, and for unmarried women. Just one example of women being poor and relying particularly on Medicaid. Medicaid is a state, is implemented state by state, and so the numbers differ. But between 27% and 70% of live births are paid for by Medicaid. And I started to talk earlier about sequestration and the fact that the dust hasn't settled yet. But again, these are the first big cuts the U.S. working class is going to see on the federal level. They've been beaten down by them in Europe, but these are the first big federal cuts that we're going to see. And these cuts are going to affect women and their children disproportionately as well. Just some numbers: 242 million cut from Head Start, 86 million from women's health programs, 29 million from programs that benefit victims of domestic violence, and over 600,000 people cut from WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children Nutritional Program for those people. So those obviously aren't the only cuts, and we talked again about the state and local cuts and cuts to the defense services, defense programs. These are all reasons why women will be propelled into struggle. You know, these are the economic reasons that women will be propelled into struggle. These are not the only struggles. There's clearly going to be struggles around immigration and immigration reform. Women are intimately involved in struggles about the environment and against rape culture. And it's, as women get pulled into these struggles, our job is going to be to identify them, to learn from them, because I certainly have a great deal to learn from other women in struggle, but also to educate them in the ideas and the methods of Marxism, of revolution, and to build the leadership able to move these struggles forward from the defensive that we've been on for all this time to the offensive, to challenge the ruling class for this world.
So we have about 20 minutes, and you can raise your questions or points, address them to the whole panel or someone particular on the panel, and I'll take a stab.